Namaste. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeevan. I'm with Social Science Baha. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this 112th Social Science Baha lecture series. And today we have Slesh A delivering the lecture. The title of the lecture is Ethnic Bias, Migration and the Formation of New Social Identities among Returnees in Nepal. As we know that migration as well as the return migration has been an integral part of Nepal's society. You also know that more than, I think if you account return migration and migration, new migration, it's about 7.5 lakhs going to different destination countries, particularly for the employment. And according to the latest statistics, around 5 lakhs Nepalese return every year in Nepal. So that signifies the importance of migration as well as return migration to Nepal. And many of you are already aware of the fact that migration and return has a lot of impacts and implications on various aspects of lives, including our social structure, political structure, power relations at the state level, at the community level, at the household level, and more so at the family and individual as well. And in today's lecture, drawing on artefactual field experience, about which he will elaborate later on, with 633 male Nepali migrant returnees, Slesh A will demonstrate how migration experience impacts ethnic tensions among returned migrant workers, and how migration experience creates certain types of identities that can be leveraged to overcome prevailing ethnic divisions, which I find very unique in terms of the methodology that you use. I think you'll be benefiting a lot from the kind of unique methodology, at least for me, that you employed for this research. So before you deliver your lecture, you already know about Slesh A's background through the email that we have circulated as an advertisement. But let me briefly introduce Slesh A and his work. Slesh A is an independent researcher based in Kathmandu. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Michigan. He previously worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the National University of Singapore from 2012 to 2020. His research intersects across three key thematic areas of economics, which is labor migration, ethnic inequality, and governance of infrastructure and public programs, with an overarching emphasis on economic development and poverty reduction. He has published several articles, op-eds, and policy papers related to those to these thematic areas. Most recently, he's conducted a labor survey of returned migrants in Nepal. He designed interventions that improve labor outcomes among migrant workers in Singapore. Similarly, he has also examined the effects of political institutions on formation of social identities and ethnic cohesion in Nepal. Likewise, he also implemented field experiments on incentivizing aid workers and political leaders in Pakistan and India. So let's see. Over to you.
Sure. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. If you don't mind, I'll stand because sitting kind of makes me listen to my voice more. Thanks for coming again. Sorry. As Jeevanji pointed out, this is a project that's very close to my heart because it sort of intersects across all three areas that I'm interested in, being migration, ethnic tension, and how do we think about policies that enables more efficient delivery of public goods and services. Right? So this is very much an ongoing work. So I'm going to share you some preliminary results that we had. It's a joint work with my colleague, previous colleague, Roy Chen from NUS as well. The idea behind it is that, see, in the last sort of couple of decades, there has been a drastic rise in temporary migration, primarily for employment, right? And it has made it probably the most dominant form of global migration that we observe today, especially from developing to developed countries. For example, new temporary migrants entering OECD countries today outnumber permanent migrants in all categories combined. Even when we look within our own region, there are more than 25 million workers from South Asia that are currently working as temporary labor migrants, mostly in other richer Asian countries. And out of that, around 3 million are perhaps Nepali migrant workers as well. And this is not that surprising because developed countries are increasingly relying on temporary labor migration to meet their labor needs, which in turn has opened up highly lucrative employment opportunities for workers from developing countries. And numerous studies that sort of tries to examine the impact of this overwhelmingly finds positive effects on economic well-being of migrants as well as their household members left behind. But what is perhaps less understood, while no less important, is how does the limited time spent by these migrants abroad affect them and their communities when they come back? Previously, so knowledge acquired by returned migrants have often been accredited to creating new jobs in their home countries. Also, changes in their political preferences that are impacted by quote-unquote sort of foreign norms that they experience while they are abroad have led to greater demand for accountability and better governance at home. On the other hand, a recent work by Gibson and company in the lab setting find that migration experience doesn't necessarily change individuals' preferences, in particular their propensity to take risk, as well as how they sort of make efficient economic decisions in the lab. Nevertheless, all of these studies suggest together that the effect of migration can extend beyond mere financial gains, as migrants' experiences themselves affect migrants' preferences as well as decision making long after they return back home. So given this, it is an interesting question, particularly in the context of Nepal, that does migration also affect social preferences of returned migrants that govern how they interact with individuals that are perhaps different in social groups than them? And more importantly, whether their migration experience itself can be leveraged to overcome pre-existing social divisions that are prevalent in the origin country. So related to this idea, at least I'm looking into immigrants that are in the US. Casey and Dustman does find that immigrants' social identity that are associated with their home country actually affects their labor market outcomes in the US. And more generally, in variety of settings, studies keep finding impact of social identity on key economic outcomes. Right? And some of these studies rely on sort of cross-country analysis or within-country analysis. But what they do find is a very strong negative relationship between ethnic diversity and economic outcomes. For example, countries that are high ethnic diversity tend to have lower GDP. And communities that are diverse in terms of their caste composition in India also have poorer provisions of public goods and services. So all these studies, what underlies this negative relationship is the idea that differing social identity within the group makes cooperation and collective action among individuals within the group more costly, and thereby ultimately leading to a poorer performance of the group. On the other hand, studies that have tried to examine this interconnectedness between social identity and economic outcome, some of the studies rely on laboratory settings, all right? So in those lab environments, researchers can measure the impact of social identity by making one of the identity of the subject more salient through priming, and then use the identity priming to examine whether it affects subjects' economic choices in the lab setting. For example, whether they contribute more to the public goods game in the lab, or whether they lend more in a microfinance groups, right? Moreover, all these lab experiments show that social identity priming, and it could be on gender, it could be on ethnicity, it could be even on political views, they tend to change even a more fundamental individual preferences, like risk, like patience, as well as even cognitive ability of an individual, which we previously thought were sort of difficult to change, right? So all these effects that we observe both in the real world data as well as in the laboratory setting can be described by the social identity model, which was first introduced in psychology but have recently been adopted in economics as well, right? Today there are different variations of social identity model, but the two main types of model are those one that are built on social norms, wherein we assume that individuals have inherent desire to follow actions that are prescribed by the group that they belong to, even if that action comes at a private cost to the individual, right? And the second general type of model builds on social preferences, where we assume that individuals also care about other people, but they care about other people who belong to their own ethnic group more than outside people, right? So those are the basic idea between the two type of models that exist today. But the key point is both of these models have extensively been used and tested to examine and explain various types of pro-social behavior that we observe between and among groups, right? The only difference between the model is how they try to explain that phenomena, right? One through norms and the other through social preferences. It'll come later. In my work, we happen to pick the social preference model to explain our results, but I do want you to keep in mind, here we are not testing which of the two models are correct. We are just trying to explain the phenomena that we observe in our lab setting by one or the both models. Yeah. So this question is perhaps interesting in Nepal, of how migration or migrant identity could influence pro-social behavior, particularly among conflicting groups, given Nepal just recently came out of this prolonged conflict that was in part fueled by ethnic tensions. Moreover, a very recent study by Gilgan and other co-authors find a rise in pro-social behavior among violence-affected communities in Nepal. This is no different, and it's in line with results from other post-conflict settings, where conflict often leads to increase in pro-sociality. But a growing number of research from those other settings also suggests that the increase in pro-sociality comes from increased in-group bias, wherein the increase is driven by strengthening towards one's own group, sometimes at the expense of the other. And interestingly, along this line, if we analyze the voting pattern in the 2017 municipal election in Nepal, we find strong co-ethnic bias in how people vote. And for example, this figure shows a very strong correlation between the share of Bahun-Chhetri voters and the share of total votes received by all Bahun-Chhetri candidates in a municipal election. And again, this is not ethnicity specific. It's not about whether I measure Bahun-Chhetri, because this problem is symmetric. If I had used a different ethnic group, you would find same positive correlation. Again, this co-ethnic bias in voting is not that different from what other people have found in terms of voting patterns in other ethnically diverse countries. Yeah. So in these other settings, both conflict and non-conflict settings, there are a lot of interventions that directly seeks to address social cohesion. And particularly because the CDD approach of development delivery, which is basically relies on strengthening and organizing community organization, relies on building social cohesion within the group. And many evaluation of these interventions, we find that the effect on social cohesion is kind of mixed. In some contexts they work, in other contexts they don't work. But again, this is not surprising because think about ethnicity is perhaps one of the most rigid and the most salient identity, right? And in a conflict such as ours where it has an underlying ethnic issue, the end of the conflict is often difficult where people don't necessarily cooperate with the other side. So in that context, overcoming such ethnic biases, particularly policy mechanisms that can address these co-ethnic biases, could be crucial for the country like Nepal to sort of successfully transition, post-conflict transition to better reconciliation and development. Lastly, our study sort of also relates to this broader literature on the development impact of migration. So in this literature, international migration is often actually viewed as one of the most effective development policies, right? But despite that, there is very little evidence on the long-term effects of temporary migration on returnee migrants. Right? Most of the effect basically revolves around immediate benefit that migrants get from increased earning. Right? Even interventions that target re-assimilation of returnees is mostly non-existent. Right? So in that context, our study, to our knowledge, is one of the very first study to examine the long-term effect of return migration programs on returnees, as well as have some direct implication of how these returnees re-assimilate back in their home country. All right, after that broad introduction, let me quickly delve into the details of the study, starting with context. As we all know, Nepal is very ethnically diverse. In this study, we broadly categorize these ethnicities into 6 broad ethnic groups. Bahun-Chhetris together account for roughly around 30% of the entire population, followed closely by Janjatis with around 23% of the population, and the rest being Madheshis, Dalit, Newars, and other minorities. So in our study, we focus on these 2 largest ethnic groups, Bahun-Chhetris and Janjatis. I just want to give a side note here that for the purpose of our study and the internal validity of our study, it is not that important of how we define ethnic groups. What is important is the subjects in the lab understand that these are the ethnic group choices they are given, and they have to self-determine which group they belong to. And the results are driven by this decision on that. In the interest of time, I'm probably going to skip through most of the slides on the history of ethnic division in Nepal. Perhaps, I mean, most likely you guys know more about that than I do. But the bottom line is that even after the introduction of parliamentary democracy, in the data we continue to find Bahun-Chhetri ethnic groups being overrepresented in different spheres in society, including in politics, in judiciary as well as in bureaucracy. And in fact, this underlying ethnic disparity in part related also with discrimination, perhaps with gender and Dalits, fueled the Maoist insurgency, which ended with the peace accord and the new constitution, right? That decentralized power by creating municipalities and provinces with the idea that it should improve ethnic representation and self-determination. And it is definitely true that these reforms have led to improvement in political representation of ethnic groups like Janajati. But even in the first municipal election held in 2017, Bahun-Chhetri still accounted for 50% of the all municipal chairs, in comparison to 33% what they represent in the population. And this is not surprising because ethnic diversity, even across all newly formed municipalities, is quite high in Nepal. Right? So all municipalities in Nepal include both groups. I don't know whether if you look at the map of all municipalities in Nepal, you see that most of the municipalities, except few mountainous municipalities in the north and northwest, are quite diverse. Moreover, the average size of the largest ethnic group in a municipality is only around 58%, barely crosses the majority. Right? And in municipalities where either the Bahun-Chhetris or the Janajatis are the majority, the other group still accounts for 13% of that population. Right? So this granular ethnic heterogeneity, right, can in fact hinder collective action at the municipality level. Right? And that sort of undermines the purpose and the effectiveness of decentralization. Right? So think about those other studies, what decentralization is sort of trying to do. It's trying to make communities more homogeneous, because remember the results where heterogeneity leads to worse collective action. Right? So in this case, given the unique nature of ethnic diversity in Nepal, that's not necessarily what's happening. On the other hand, in the last 2 decades, coinciding with the conflict itself, migration of Nepalese workers abroad have drastically increased. Right? And between 2001 and 2011, the share of migrants rose 6-fold, remittance as the share of GDP rose 10-fold, we all know about this. By 2011, 1 in every 5 households in Nepal had a migrant worker living abroad, outside India. And the circular nature and the temporary nature of this migration implies that migrant workers who have returned back actually make a sizable group here today. In 2017, returned migrants accounted for 7% of the overall working age population in Nepal and 16% of male working age population in Nepal, right? With the average age of only 23 years old, which means these individuals are quite active in their communities, and many of them actually also engage in political activities as well. So in our data, who are all returned migrants, 20% have joined returned migrant association groups or membership groups, or participate actively in different activities organized by that group. Similarly, 38% were member of their neighborhood committees, and 22% had joined some political party. Right? Also, quite a large 73% had attended a budget discussion meeting organized by their local governments. Right? And if we want to understand the profile of these returned migrants, we can also rely on the permit data, because all migrants require a permit from Department of Foreign Affairs to go abroad. And if we look at the permits issued between 2017 and 2019, the first thing that jumps out is majority of temporary labor migrants are men, around about 95%. And most of them go to countries in the GCC or Malaysia. Again, I guess for this audience that is not that surprising, but it is in the general context of migration and how people think about migration. So what is unique to these countries is that these migrants in these countries are often restricted to working in few migrant-dominated sectors, right? What that means is among our subjects, on average, they worked with 18 other Nepali migrant workers while they were abroad in their latest job. And more than 50% were Nepalese who belonged to a different ethnic group than themselves. Also, migrants face strict social and physical mobility restrictions while they are abroad. Their families don't accompany them, right? They often live in migrant dormitories that are separated from natives. And in our data, subjects typically shared room with 5 other Nepali migrant workers, right? Around 50% of them were from a different ethnic group than themselves. More than 70% had also lent money to another Nepali migrant worker while they were abroad. And again, around 50% were from a different ethnic group than theirs. So what this data tells us is that migration experience engenders quite a lot of intermixing and interaction across ethnic lines among migrant Nepali workers. And so which could sort of increase social cohesion across these different groups. In particular, think about a migrant worker isolated from their own family, living and working abroad in many contexts, high-risk jobs, right? Can create sort of this shared common identity that can cut across ethnic lines, right? And that can lead to strengthening of national identity or even the creation of a new migrant identity within that group. So the question we are interested in answering, finally getting to it, is in the lab experiment, we want to test whether our subjects, first of all, exhibit co-ethnic biases in their pro-social behavior. Okay? And I'm going to come back to what pro-social behavior is. Second, whether their migration experience made salient through priming can change their pro-social behavior, particularly towards an individual who belongs to a different group than them. Yeah? And if yes, then whether this migration effect can address some of the co-ethnic biases that we observe in Nepal today. Yeah? Our main pro-social outcomes are altruism, cooperation, and ethnic prejudice in selecting a leader or a judge, what we call an arbiter. Right? And these outcomes are measured by the subject's choices when they play different games. I will explain a little in detail of what each of these outcomes are and how they are different. Before I go there, unfortunately, I do need to set up a theoretical model, but I'm not going into any detail. Like I said, to explain our results, we use the social identity model that relies on social preferences. What that means is if an agent I, UI, is the happiness that the agent I feels, right? It depends on the monetary value that the agent I receives or earns, but also depends on the monetary value that the other agent receives. It's hard to see here, but let me simplify this just for explanation. If I take R0, one of the example of this utility function is my utility depends on how much I earn, and partly also in how much my partner earns. Okay? This is where the social preference model deviates from a standard neoclassical economics model. In the economics standard neoclassical model, my happiness only comes from my payoff. Right? Here, it partly comes from my payoff, but also from someone else's payoff. Yeah? And that trade-off is captured by alpha. So how much I care about the other person depends on the value of the alpha. In the Shayu model, one way to understand what that alpha is that alpha is directly related to the social distance I perceive with respect to someone else. Right? So if you and I are playing a game, if I feel that you are socially more distant from me, my value that I assign to your alpha to you would be less than if I'm playing with someone who I perceive to be more socially closer to. Yeah? The genius of this setup is this social distance perceived by agent I towards agent J, my match, depends on the sum of the squared distance across any social identity group that exists in the society, right? So what this is saying is, first, an individual can have multiple social identities at the same time, right? And it could be built on standard demographic characteristics, but also based on preferences and past experience, like veganism or returned migrants, right? So the agent themselves can select how they want to form their identities and what identities they care about. So this social distance changes, like in my example, let's say ethnicity is one of the dimensions I care about. If I'm matched with someone with the same ethnic group as I, one of the dimension of Qi minus Qj would be 0, right, in the ethnic dimension, versus if I'm matched with someone who's a different ethnic group than mine. Right? In that context, my overall social distance to that person would be larger. Right? Also, it also matters what I care about. There might be multiple identities, but I might not care about ethnic identity at all. In that context, I behave as if you are not closer to me, even if you have the same ethnic group. So it's all self-agent driven. Right? So in our research design, we focus on two identities. We focus on ethnic identity and we focus on migrant identity. Okay? In one dimension, our subjects are either matched with someone who belongs to the same ethnic group, or they are matched with someone from a different ethnic group. Okay? On the other dimension, half our subjects are primed to activate their migrant identity before playing these games. Whereas in the other half, they are primed on a neutral identity before playing the games. I'll explain that a little bit later. So what that means, just quickly, is if you are a subject in our study, either you belong to one of these 4 boxes. Right? Either you're matched with the same ethnic identity as yourself and given a neutral priming before playing games, or you're given a migrant priming, and so on. Right? So we have 4 different treatment groups in this design. One thing I want to point out is we could have easily used migrants and non-migrants and compared them, right, of how they behave with in-group versus out-group. The reason we don't do that is migration is a self-selection process. The problem is people who perhaps choose to be a migrant also exhibit different preferences, including regarding how they perceive other ethnic groups, versus those who chose not to be a migrant. So in our study, if we just compare migrants and non-migrants, the difference on how they behave pro-socially towards other group could capture this inherent difference that led certain people to be migrant versus non-migrant, rather than the effect of the migrancy itself. So what priming allows us to do is randomize whether you are a migrant or a non-migrant for those 20 minutes you play the game, although everyone is a migrant. Right? The treatment group are more migrant than other for that period. Yes, it is limited in the context that it's confined to the experiment itself, but it allows us to overcome this big sort of heading here, which is self-selection into migrancy. I'm just gonna tell you what our migrant prime does. Our migrant prime is basically a 20-minute questionnaire that asks you questions to remember your migrant experience, yeah? Which is followed by 4 generic migration-related pictures that are flashed in front of you in the wall, and a structured conversation with the lab assistant related to what kind of questions you answered in the last 20 minutes, right? If they want to elaborate more. Neutral prime, on the other hand, is a 20-minute questionnaire that asks about your experience as a school children and school experience. So it's designed to not trigger any particular identity, right? And we test that as well later. Followed by 4 generic pictures of nature, and then a conversation with the lab assistant. The thing about this design is both migrant and non-migrant treatment, migrant and neutral treatment goes through both priming. It's just the sequence of when they receive migrant priming versus the neutral priming that is different. Right? So if I happen to be in the migrant treatment, I am surveyed on my basic demographic characteristics as well as cognitive test. Second, then I receive a migrant priming questionnaire right before I play the games. Right? After I play the game, I receive neutral priming. So my behavior in the games are not affected by neutral priming. Whereas on the neutral treatment, it's reversed. I'm administered neutral priming before playing the games and then administer a migrant priming, which should not affect my game's outcome. So basically that's the idea. But everything else in terms of the time spent on each of these subsection of the priming as well as questionnaires as well as games are identical. So there is no manipulation by numerators or lab assistants where I administrate the game differently whether you're matched with the in-group versus out-group identity. It doesn't happen in our experiment. All right, I'm really over time, but let me tell you, because this might be important to understand why the heck are we doing all this. First is the dictator game, okay? In the dictator game, it's quite simple. Agents receive 200 rupees upfront, and they are told that how much of that money do you want to give to your partner? And that partner could be either from your own ethnic group or different ethnic group, and you could be either primed as a migrant or a neutral, right? This is an example of a non-strategic game, and more importantly for our context, amount given by the agent measures the altruism that they exhibit towards the other person. Okay? And if I go back to the utility function, what our subject should be doing is they should be entering every possible amount they can give. It goes from 0 to all 200, right? Put it into the utility function, calculate how much total happiness they would receive, right? And whichever amount gives them the highest utility, you pick that amount, right? That seems logical of how people make decisions, at least most of the time. The beauty of that equation is that we don't necessarily need to know who these individuals are and what their preferences are. For an average normal individual, you can calculate what is their optimal amount X that gives them the biggest bang for the buck, okay? And that is equal to alpha E. So here, clearly how much I give to a person depends on how much I care about the person, which seems intuitive. Okay? More importantly, you can see that if I don't care about the other person, I should put all 200 for myself, which makes sense. Right? Second, more I care about the other person, more I'm going to contribute because my X star is an increasing function of alpha. So if I care about my own ethnic group more, I give that person more money than someone who does not belong to my ethnic group. Is that clear? And for all of those, this is how economists think about altruism. Basically, think about people tend to give money or donate money to the cause they like, right? More than the cause they don't like. This idea of this captures that because I give more money to the cause I like because my alpha from the person that benefits from that cause, the social distance is closer to me. Right? That's the idea. So inherently we are all selfish, it's just that giving money makes us happy. Right? That's the social identity model. The second game we play is the public goods game. In this game, both the agents, agent I and A, both of them are given 200 rupees and they are told that they can independently and simultaneously decide how much money from 200 they want to put in a common pot. Okay? The amount in the pot is then multiplied by 1.5 and then redistributed equally between the two agents. So each agent wins how much they initially did not put in the pot and how much they got equally redistributed back from the pot. This amount that the agent contributes to the pot measures their level of cooperation. And I will briefly go into what that means. But first of all, if I solve that equation in this game, the optimal amount that the person should put is quite complex, not like the previous one, but it is still increasing in alpha. More I care about the other person, more I should contribute into the common pot. Okay? But because it's a non-strategic game, how much I win depends on what the other person does as well, right, in this game. Because of that, it also depends on what I believe the other person is going to do as well, right? A side note of this that is important is if alpha is 0, in that game, you contribute nothing to the pot, just like the altruism game, yeah? So the Nash equilibrium is, if I don't care about anyone, I don't put anything into the pot and keep my 200. But the crazy bit is, even if alpha is 0, both agents can be better off by putting money into the pot. Although the optimal option is to not do that. Yeah? And the reason is, for both agents to put money into the pot and benefit, there needs to be coordination and cooperation between the two agents. Okay? For example, if these are two agents, either of us put nothing into the pot, each of us make 200, right? And our math equation is telling you this is the optimal option, this is the maximum they can win, and they should do. If they put everything into the pot, we add another 200, right? Because we multiply by 1.5 and equally gets divided. They actually win 300 each. So the surprising bit here is, although it's beneficial for both to put money into the pot, the math is telling you they should not do it. And the reason is because if I put everything into the pot and the other person reneges, right? Yes, I agreed with you, but when it comes to putting the money, they don't put anything in the money. Then what happens is obviously the other person is better off, right? Than not putting anything into the pot. Which means there is a possibility of reneging here. If this person had put everything into the pot and I had also put, I would have gone 300, right? That person. But although I agreed to put everything, at the last minute I changed my mind, I actually improved my payoff. Right? Whereas I got worse off than putting nothing into the pot. This is an example of a free riding problem. Right? In this example, the person, agent, this person, the other person, is free riding of me. Yeah? And this risk of free riding leads to both agents putting nothing into the pot. Right? This is a very standard example of what we call tragedy of the commons. Right? It's why public goods are often underinvested and not maintained well. Right? But the insight this model gives you here is that if alpha is more than 0, people tend to contribute into the public goods game. Okay? Second, even in the face of free riding. Second, if alpha increases, I contribute more. So think about the studies that previously I mentioned where societies that are more heterogeneous tend to have lower GDP, worse provisions of public goods. It's explained by this model, right? Because in a homogeneous group, alpha is much more higher than a heterogeneous group, therefore people are voluntarily contributing into the pot. And I tell this to all my friends here, that's the reason where I live today in Patan is more well-governed than where I used to live previously in Kathmandu. Because my neighborhood is a lot more homogeneous than where I grew up in Kathmandu. And it's not the difference in preferences and what people think is good or bad. It's just that differences in alpha among the group affects how much I'm willing to cooperate within the group, which in turn affects real economic outcome. Lastly, we know that this had always existed, right? It's not that recently economists have found out that there's a free riding problem and all that. The way society deals with it is by putting laws and regulations, right? Think about taxation, it's the same thing. People know that if it's voluntary, no one's going to contribute. I'm going to make laws and regulations such that we are forced to contribute with a punishment mechanism if I renege. Right? So in that context, even a diverse group can cooperate and coordinate under the umbrella of judiciary and laws. So we try to replicate that in a lab setting on a different game where all subjects play with a different ethnic group than theirs, but if subjects contribute too little money into the pot, they are told they will be punished, that their earnings would be subtracted. They were not told how much is the threshold of too little and how much money would be subtracted, okay? And in the experiment, actually, it was $50 for both. The fourth variation of this is that today, who makes these laws and regulations, who implements them? These are elected officials that we vote for, right? So we made a variation to this also in the fourth game, where they were told that the person who would decide how much is too little for you and for the other person is an arbiter. And you have the option to choose who is the punisher. And the two options they were provided were a person who belonged to the same ethnic group as them and a person who belonged to a different ethnic group. Yeah? And we want to sort of understand how does social identity, both ethnic identity as well as migrant priming, affects individuals' decision to pick a elected representative who sort of decides who to punish and who not to punish. Unfortunately, the theoretical prediction for the subject's arbiter choice, who they tend to, is quite difficult and complex. But I'll show you a figure that sort of explains a little bit. Each game becomes more and more complex. Here's a graph of whether I would prefer an in-group or an out-group arbiter, depending on what my value of alpha is and what these different beliefs are about the other person. The key thing to know here is in any of these environments, as alpha goes up, which is I'm moving from left to right, I'm more likely to transition from picking an in-group to an out-group arbiter. All right? Except for a few cases here where I reverse, but in general, the transition is from going from white to pink. And you can calculate that by running a simulation where you can 100,000 times pick random alphas and different values and see for each case a small increment in alpha, how does that affect their arbiter choice? Yeah? In 14% of those increment, it went from preferring an in-group to an out-group. Most of the time, it did not affect their choice. Very small amount, it went the other way. Okay. I'm really behind, so I'm going to skip all that, but you can ask me questions later. I'll show you the results. First of all, this is the result of the dictator game. Quite straightforward because everything is set up. In the neutral treatment, this is our normal group without migration priming. When I was asked how much money you want to divide with the other person, pure altruism, if the other person is in group, on average, I tend to give 61 rupees out of 200 to the other person. But if the other person happens to be out group, I only give around 50 rupees. So this difference of 12 rupees here on average is interpreted as the difference in altruism between in-group and out-group that our subjects exhibit in the game. Is that clear? And if you think about it, it's roughly around 24% more people tend to give to your in-group. You can argue that, what is the cost to the person giving money, but 200 is not a trivial amount. Right? In our experiment, they earned on average 1,000 rupees in total. But if they had played all the games correctly, they would have, at max, could have earned 2,000 rupees. So they're giving up 1,000 rupees because of different preferences that they exhibit depending on migrant prime versus neutral prime and all that. Yeah? And if I look at among the migrant treatment, there is absolutely no difference between how much I give to the in-group or the out-group. Right? So basically the different diff is around 12.25, but the point is that migrancy completely eradicates any in-group bias in altruism, right? In our study. Let's look at the public goods game. In the public goods game, again, neutral treatment, you see in-group bias in cooperation, right? Around 30 rupees, which is roughly 40%. In the migrant treatment, again, any co-ethnic bias in cooperation, mind you, this is a strategic game, right? Completely disappears. And just to make sure that our subjects don't understand the game and they don't calculate the optimal X, we can test a little bit of that, because our model also tells us that how much they put into the cup should be positively correlated with how much they think the other person would put into the cup, right? And we can see that in our data, because we measure their beliefs as well. Their action across all 4 groups are positively correlated with how much they put into the cup. So these decisions are not arbitrary. They follow the logic of the model that we're trying to use here. Lastly, on the arbiter choice, among the neutral treatment, this surprised quite a lot, actually, us, because 58% tend to choose the arbiter who belongs to their own group, yeah? Which I thought was quite low. I would think it would be 90%, but yeah. Whereas among the migrant treatment, that went down to only 47%. Right? This difference is small, but it is statistically significant. These are meaningful differences, at least in terms of the inference. I'll show you one additional result because I'm already over time. Like I said, we also have public goods game that have punishment, right? So we want to understand the difference in how much an individual contributes to the pot based on whether they are punished or not. And you see that across all treatment groups, in a game that is without punishment, which is the darker one, relative to that, if there is an exogenous punishment mechanism, people tend to contribute more. Okay? And that value is also statistically significant. Moreover, if the punishment mechanism comes from an actual person rather than unobserved exogenous punishment, they comply even more. Yeah? Because the white one is where the arbiter is the one punishing it. So what does this all mean? It means that we observe coethnic bias in both altruistic and cooperative behavior that ranges from around 20% to 40% among our subjects on ethnicity. Migrant prime completely eliminates in-group bias in both strategic and non-strategic environment, at least among our subjects. And the subjects are also more willing to choose an out-group arbiter under the migrant treatment. So comparing our empirical results with our theoretical model, what we can infer is that social distance, and therefore alpha, between our subjects who are matched with the outgroup but got a migrant treatment, treat the outgroup person similarly as an in-group treatment. Yeah? So migrant priming completely reduces social distance that exists among different ethnic groups. And this lends to the idea that migrant experience can create a unifying identity that sort of reduces ethnic tensions. I know this is a stretch, but from a very tiny lab experiment to a big claim, but it's an evidence that lends support to that. Yeah? And just to build on that, if I showed you, sorry, I don't have that on. Oh, the same voting correlation that I found in election data, if I re-estimate that voting correlation separately for districts that send a lot of migrants versus municipalities that send not that many migrants, the co-ethnic correlation is a lot statistically lower for municipalities that tend to send a lot more migrants. Right? So there is some sort of evidence to suggest that what we are doing in the lab is not just random, but I will let you be the judge of that. The other interesting thing about this result is punishment does work, right? Punishment increases cooperation, and I guess it's not surprising. Hence we have governments and rules. The type of punishment matter, but I'll leave that. But one way to think about what punishment is that punishment mechanism in a public goods game increases cooperation to the extent that any in-group biases are masked. So if you are a society where you worry about in-group biases affecting how individuals behave and therefore contribute to public goods game, punishment becomes important. Right? How you enforce it fairly also becomes important. And particularly, what our results show with priming in absence of punishment mechanism or ability to deliver fair punishment, migrant priming sort of has the same effect as punishment. Not to the same level, because if you look at the difference, the jump from the difference in in-group bias with no punishment versus punishment, it completely eradicates, but the additional jump with arbitrary migrant priming is not that high. All right, sorry I went a little overboard and rushed through all this, but this is very much an ongoing project in the sense that although the results are done, we're still working on having a first draft. Moreover, this is just one of the many sort of projects we tend to build going forward with similar kind of experiments. So any questions and feedback would be appreciated, as well as those topics I did not get time to talk about, like how do we implement it and all that. Please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy, for a very comprehensive presentation. To be frank, it was very difficult for me to follow the method that you presented, but I think many of the participants here, hopefully they could follow you. But I could follow the findings that you presented towards the end of your presentation. Given we are slightly over the time, I think it would be wise to take some questions. But before that, Slesh A, maybe you can come in later on. But if you could also let us know how you recruited these participants for the lab test, it would be I think interesting for us to know. And then was it? I was just wondering while following your presentation whether it was tested in Nepal or was in destination period. It was not clear in your presentation, but yeah, please let us know. So let's take a couple of questions from the floor. The floor is open. Okay, I can see three
you know how
hands there.
you talked about the fact that you looked at...
Would you please introduce yourself
Okay.
and ask the question?
My name is Dorje. My question relates to how you used voter preference from 2017 municipal elections. Have you done that with the 2022 federal level elections and so on and so forth? Have you looked at that? The reason I asked is because I've been analyzing the 2022 election results.
Okay. One more there. Yeah. Let's take a couple of more.
Indigenous greetings, everyone. I'm Salman Nama. So I have also researched as a young researcher in a feminist participatory action research on indigenous returning migrant women of Chautara. So वैदेशिक रोजगारीबाट फर्किनु भएको आदिवासी महिलाहरूमा अनि few comments, few suggestions, few चाहिँ like guidance जस्तो पनि I need from you. So I think first starting would be the term we have used is Janajati. I think the correct term should be Adivasi Janajati. And second is how many women were involved, because in the labor migration trend in Nepal, women are completely just not there in the data. And maybe you can talk about that as well. And another thing is, so we can see in women labor migration, we can see a lot of Adivasi Janajati women, especially from Sindhupalchok, Kavi Palanchok. So do you think we can establish migration as an indigenous women issue? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Kripendra Amartya. I've been a long time Neva activist myself, and as also a Janajati activist. And as we've seen that Neva and Janajati is kept separately. Now the question comes in is, in your research, have you found that all the Janajatis align towards in a single in-group, or do they actually are differentiated? Like, you know, the Muggers and Limbu are like completely different area. They may look similar, but they're different. Has there been any impact on that as well? Thank you.
Hi, Slesh. Thanks for that, Anna and Tara. I was just curious to know who funded this research and why.
Maybe I should answer that.
Yeah,
I'll
please.
forget about
Yeah,
that.
let's
The study is based in Nepal. It's based in 6 districts, eastern districts. And we recruited returnee migrants who have returned back in the last 10 years. All male. I'll come back to your question. They were mostly recruited from the roster that many local governments are supposed to keep of returned migrants. And while recruiting, we didn't tell them that the study was on migrancy. We told them that the study is related to youth labor employment. And they were guaranteed at least a 500 rupee reward for showing up. But obviously the way the game is designed, everyone, regardless of what action they take in the spectrum, would guarantee to win 500, so we told them that. But obviously on average, they won like around 1,000 rupees. So there is a selection on sample here, which I want to say, because it's not a representative sample of returned migrants, even returned migrants who have come back in 10 years, all male. It is selected on our recruitment, how much people cared about showing up and all that, right? But within the selected sample, they are randomized. And therefore, they're not self-selected into whether I matched with the ethnic group or whether I got a migrant treatment or not. Therefore, internally, the experiment is valid, but for an external validity, it's not a representative sample. And if I replicate this perhaps in some other context, it is likely that you could find a different result, right? The study does not allow us to say that this is replicable with the same results. Sorry, what was this? Yeah, so the election one, I have not looked at the new election. The reason is mostly convenience. We had the data and we had used it on some other paper. So we sort of had already cleaned the data, and that's all I have to say. But it would be interesting to see how does the pattern of ethnicity-based voting change over time as well. And it's not just affected by migration, but also internal environment in Nepal itself, right? So there are many factors that affect your alpha. So it would be interesting to see, or even over time, whether this pattern have changed. In terms of your question, there are no women in this study, partly because majority of the migrant workers are predominantly men. That doesn't mean women don't go, obviously. Many women go, many different countries, including where I used to work, Singapore. It doesn't mean migrancy would not have similar effects. I would say though that at least among foreign domestic workers, the way they interact is a lot more isolated because they tend to live with their employers, relative to men migrant workers who have more interaction among co-workers and co-living arrangement, which tends to suggest that the effect might be bigger among men. But we did not do that. I am not an expert on ethnic issues in Nepal at all. In fact, I wanted to show you that the way we divided ethnic group is completely arbitrary. So what we did was for all participants before they played the game or participated in the study, we said, we as a researcher have divided all Nepalese into 6 categories based on caste and ethnicity. These are the 6 groups: Bahun-Chhetri, Madeshis, Newar, Janajati, Dalits, other minorities. Now, please tell us, who do you think you belong to? And we don't impose, even if your last name suggests some other ethnic group and you happen to choose, it's fine. What this is trying to do is, in the game setting, make your ethnic identity salient. And that saliency comes from whatever on the 6 groups you choose to be. So from our game perspective, these are the only 6 ethnic groups that exist in the game environment. Yeah? And I could have easily, and people have replicated this game by not saying groups that are more in line with real world, but literally red, blue, green. And then in that environment, the group that matters is whether you're green or not green. Here, what we try to sort of copy that idea, but made the group identity at least more in line with the ethnic identity that we observe in the real world. Yeah. But I take your point, and we'll also adjust in terms of how we refer to the group. However, in certain aspect, we can't change the name because that's the name that the subjects were told. So by changing the name in certain places, we are sort of not being true to what we did. What was your question, sorry?
So I was asking, like, is this like, have you found any correlation between the Janajati having the same idea, or like just a political movement?
So again, this is related to what I'm saying here, right? So basically, obviously within each group there's a lot of nuances and subgroups. And it is probably likely if I had played these games among Bahun-Chhetris and then divided into subgroups, they would have shown co-ethnic biases. Unfortunately, because that's not the design of the study, I can't answer to that, right? Scientifically or statistically. But all I can say is when Nepalese men who are returning migrants were offered to choose one of these groups and they made the choices, they acted differently when they were matched with a different person who did not belong to the group they chose in that context. Yeah. Last question, in terms of funding, this was partly funded by National University of Singapore, partly through different grants. In terms of answering why they funded it, the purpose perhaps is not so much to increase policy dialogue or have any significant impact on policy itself. It's to contribute to the understanding of economic theory of how we understand group individual behavior and individual interactions. So some of these models that I talked about are fairly new in economics, particularly the behavioral game theory. And most of the results come from obviously US and Europe. But these are few studies that have tried to sort of take that idea and implement in a developing country context. But the thing is, the results are fairly comparable across these different societies with different values. So in that context, it is building on the knowledge base of in economics, as well as in theory to understand whether these hypothetical models that people are building in maths actually are saying something and testing it.
Let's take another round of questions. Sabinji.
Hi, my name is Sabin. I'm a researcher affiliated with the social science Bahun. Thank you, Slesh, for this provocative presentation. I think the field of behavioral economics is relatively new in Nepal, and particularly in the way you have applied in the field of migration studies to study why people behave the way the way they do is quite unique. So the rigor that you apply, I'm still trying to play catch up to it to be able to understand it properly. It's much like Jivanji. I have a question. It might be kind of this fantastical question and might sound a little silly. So if the dormitories that you speak of, where migrants go and go live with other migrants from other parts of Nepal, other ethnicities, could themselves be conceived of as a lab in a way, because they spend a limited amount of time inside a controlled setting, right? So where there is a very comparatively smaller space for articulation, all kinds of extending yourself to the other, right? So one of your findings show that when they come back with acquired behavior of extending themselves to groups from other ethnicities and caste. So they are more extroverted in that respect. And you used one of the slides which I thought was quite fascinating to look at, comparing municipalities that have sent away more migrants versus municipalities that have not, and how that affects voting behaviors. My question is this: when migrants return with the kind of behavior that you're alluding to, does that kind of behavior have a shelf life after having spent a considerable amount of time in their natural habitat? And does it eventually go away and people go back to behaving in their normal manner? That's the question.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Maniram Goyal. Most of the things have been come already, and I have a soft question. I'm really curious to know about the punishment, how punishment did worked in your research. I'm really curious to know.
Thank you. There is another question. There's the last. On the right. No, we don't.
So maybe you'd like to.
Yeah, so 2 points I think that's important that you brought up. First, the migrant experience of most of these returnees is very unique, right? They, unlike how people have traditionally thought about migration, where you go and assimilate abroad, is not what exactly these new migrants are experienced when they are abroad. In fact, most of the evidence on returnee migrants come from either returning refugees or students whose interaction in the foreign abroad is a lot more intensive with the natives than these migrants. So there is a lot of question in economics itself is what is the long-term effect of this very limited exposure to returning migrants. Right? Having said that though, most of the temporary migration programs today that are increasingly becoming the most dominant way men and women from developing countries tend to go abroad relies on segregation between migrants and natives. In fact, that segregation itself allows these developed countries to take in migrants without having to pay the political and economic cost of bringing in migrants. Right? So there's a lot of work separate to this, but slightly related to what you're saying, that shows that we face this trade-off between equity, is it a right-based approach versus should we just allow migrants to go? And in most contexts, countries like Sweden and all, that do provide more sort of equal footing for migrants versus natives, actually don't contribute towards global equality, right? So countries like GCC, Malaysia, that do get a bad rap, and perhaps in many contexts rightly so, in global data contribute the most in terms of providing global equity. So in that context, it is not a very unique phenomena that migrants live in dorms when they go abroad. More importantly, as developed countries' labor needs binds more and more, this type of migration is going to grow even further because it's sort of viewed as a triple win. Developed countries can benefit without sort of antagonizing the natives. Developing country individuals also, although they are more restricted, still benefit because the wage differentials are so much higher, right? And hence, it's going to carry on. In terms of your question of how does experience and how it shapes my preferences, what is the shelf life? Even this experiment result tells you that the shelf life is short. All the results here is driven by priming that happened in 20 minutes, right? So think about it. Even people who are behaving quote unquote badly are returned migrants. They have gone through the same experience as the migrant treatment. It's just that they were not reminded of their migrant experience at that moment. So this result suggests that identity itself is very fluid and it changes minute to minute, and hence the priming works. Otherwise, priming won't work, right? So I do agree with you, but it has a bigger implication of what this result means for the overall reassimilation process of migrants and whether this is actually useful. What I would say to that is, what I cannot answer here is, even among the neutral group that behave badly, if I had measured non-migrants, are they behaving better than non-migrants, right? I don't have that difference because it's self-selection, so you can't necessarily tell is it because of migration itself or self-selected. But what we can at least show is among migrants, if you have a policy that makes their identity more salient, And it doesn't even have to be migrant, right? It can be any unifying identity. Like national identity is something that historically many governments have used to prime them on. It works. Does that answer your question? Yeah. As answering these questions, it seems like I'm undermining my own results, but these are the caveats under which the study is conducted. There was another question. Oh, punishment. So the way punishment works is we say you play the same game again with a different person that you have never interacted before. But we tell them you can put money into the pot, but if you put too little money into the pot, your money would be reduced. We did not tell them how much is too little and what is the reduction amount. Right? Too little was 50 in the exogenous punishment, and we subtracted 50 rupees from their winnings at the end if they crossed the threshold. In the fourth game, they were told it's the same punishment mechanism, but the person who decides how much is too little is going to be these two arbiters. And we show them, oh, this is the person that belongs to ethnicity Bahun-Chhetri with the last name Casey. These are real people. And or a person who's Janajati whose last name is XYZ, right? And you can first choose who you want to pick as an arbiter on this game. Once you pick that, then you contribute whatever amount you like to put into the game. It multiplies, splits, and at the end we tell them, oh, the person you chose decided to punish you because their threshold for you did not meet it, and therefore I'm going to take 50 rupees back. If not, they kept the 50 rupees. That was the sequence. Does that answer your question?
Shrestha, would you like to ask a question?
Can I speak loud?
Yeah.
Okay. Or maybe we need mic to record.
Thanks. So just the finding that it increases sort of a cooperative behavior or attitude. But when you go out to work, it's also a competitive environment, right? Like for you to grow, you're always, and then if your competition is probably belonging to a certain ethnic group, then maybe what is the literature at on that? Like it's probably related to the degree of how close you feel they are. For example, Brahmins and Janajatis probably, you still feel in the experiment that they are much closer to you. For example, if I was competing with somebody, or if I'm playing this game with somebody much further away, some ethnicity, some country's identity that I don't know of. So in that setting, do you think those results would still, that cooperative behavior would still exist? Or I don't know if there's literature that suggests, depending on that degree, how much it would differ. I don't know.
Yeah. Shall I answer? Yes. Answer to that is yes. Only thing we measure here is cooperation under the rules and environment that we created in our lab. Right? That means the game was played in isolation inside a room with no other individual present except the lab assistant. And there are studies that show even the characteristic of a lab assistant changes how people behave. One important example that might be relevant to what you're asking is a study that shows that when two people play a cooperative game, if they play a game in vacuum versus if they are observers, it affects how they behave in terms of their cooperation. Neutral observers who have nothing to do with the game. Not only that, the composition of those observers in terms of which group is X% and which group are Y% affects how I respond to a person who I'm playing the game with. So each very minute detail of what you play the game under matters. There is absolutely no way in the lab setting you can replicate real world environment. What these studies try to do is the other way. Instead of making the environment complex and more closer to the real world, they try to make the environment more and more simple. And the most simplest is a dark room with basically two people with a speaker telling them what to do. Because in that environment, we know that the only thing that matters is alpha, right? So more variables you introduce to their game environment, more we are away from our mathematical model. Because in the utility function in that game, there are only 3 variables: alpha, payoff of yours, and payoff of the other person. Anything else, including the shape of a cup, is not part of that model. And if you think that whether I see a cup that makes me associate more with unity versus conflict, that can change how you behave in a cooperative game. That is the limitation of a lab experiment. But what lab experiment allows you is the controlling the environment and making it simple makes you more closer to the mathematical model that gives us an intuition of what an altruism is. If we think about it, altruism is such a multi-dimensional complex concept. But what the model is trying to do is capture that multi-dimensional abstract concept as a single-dimensional parameter alpha, right? Or a multi-dimensional parameter Dij. But it cannot be the reality, we know that. But what it allows us is to make the math simple so that we can understand some aspect of altruism that is captured by the model, which is our X star in a dictator game is directly proportional to that alpha. Yeah. So.
Thank you. I think we have time just for a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm Rajiv Nyopani, associated with Social Science Lab. I'm still imagining the lab environment. Like, how would I know if somebody is Brahmin, Kshatriya, Madhisi? For me, a Slesh A looks like maybe Brahmin or Kshatriya, Madhisi. Oh, no, I don't know. Is this just a visual impressions that one needs to identify with other, or if it's a visual, just a visual experience, then I think it's not that reliable to imply the result. I'm not sure though.
Let's take another question.
Just simple question. Which were the districts where the study took place in? Can you name them?
Please use the mic. We are recording it, so.
Oh, sorry. Which districts did this study take place in?
6 districts.
Oh, okay.
Chapa, Morang, all these 6 districts were part of the study. It's purely eastern districts. Obviously, there is no logic to it. It was logistically easier for us where we had the setup to do that.
Let's take the last question.
Thank you. I would like to ask about how the data significantly show that in the formation of new identity among returnees. And I think the new identity formation is mainly based on how they are reintegrated in our market. So is the data show any correlations among ethnicity, their education background to the job market they are reintegrated here after return?
Last question, Chawla.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Supriya Mander, and I think it's probably more of a comment than a question proper. They are framed as questions, but I guess it's not within the scope of this research or even the findings to explain. I was just thinking about how you talked about migration or being a migrant as a kind of unifying identity. And in my mind, I'm going through this scenario where, I don't know, someone in the Sram Mantralayar, or I don't know, or perhaps someone with a maybe more nationalistic, more right-wing oriented inclination may take some of the statements and sort of interpret them as like the need for a unifying identity and how the erasure of ethnic identity is for the greater good. It's morally beneficial to do that, right? So that's like one scenario that I was playing through in my mind. The others, some curiosities I had about possible future implications of what was studied here. So one, for example, even the proportion of migrant labor is different among ethnic groups themselves. Like certain ethnic groups, there's a very high proportion as opposed to others. And how that would correlate in terms of, let's say, voting patterns. once people come back in. And also when we talk about things like, what was the term that you used? Co-ethnic voting, like as in people voting across ethnic groups, voting for representatives outside of their own ethnic group. And so the sort of correlation between migrant labor trajectories across different districts and the voting results in them as well. I'm sort of thinking about what that co-ethnic voting pattern actually means, as in Janajati's voting for a Bahun representative is co-ethnic, but then so is Bahun's voting for a Janajati representative. And statistically, I feel like maybe it goes in one particular direction as opposed to the other, especially like, for example, as a side note, when we speak of things like intercaste marriage or inter-ethnic marriage in Nepal, usually it's Bahun men marrying other demographic women as opposed to the other way. Like the word co-ethnic or like, the equivalency sort of masks some of these internal schisms in a way. Anyway, just rambling at this point, just some thoughts I have.
Sure, I can start with the last question, but if I forget to answer it, please remind me. In terms of what it means for unifying identity, all I can say is in the economics model of how we think about provisions to public goods and within group cooperation, homogeneity is important. Heterogeneity imposes cost in collective action, and it is something that is apparent in the model, not just the social identity model, but even in the very standard economics model. And you do see results of self-segregation in cities that sort of lends to the idea that it's driven partly by economics and not always by discrimination and stereotypes. Having said that, I mean, that's not the only holy grail of we should decrease cost of collective action. There are other aspects of it in the real world we care about. It is obviously not true that people haven't thought about this. In fact, many countries have tried to build national identity in order to mobilize its population to work more collectively. Right? So, on the other hand, even in the context of Nepal, like decentralization is partly driven by this idea that at the local level, a group that is more closer is able to function better. And one of it is to decrease heterogeneity in the group. The other could be that regardless of ethnicity, if I'm close neighbors with each other, I function better. Right? Even in the Shire model, ethnicity is not the only thing that matters. There are unlimited social identities. And as you decentralize, the idea is people within the community become more and more closer to each other, and therefore there is this reduction in the cost of working together. Sorry, I missed the last point you made. What was that?
It was about like co-ethnic.
Okay, yeah. In the result that I showed you in the graph, it is symmetric. If I had shown you in the x-axis instead of Bahun-Chhetri, the rest, the result correlation would be the same. It's not Bahun-Chhetri or any specific group specific, that result. It just happened to be Bahun-Chhetri being the reference group. Yeah. Also, in our results I didn't share, you could see the effects separately for Bahun-Chhetris and separately for Janajatis. In our study, we find identical results for both groups. And I don't have explanation or model of why that should or should not be. In fact, our model doesn't take into account this asymmetry, it's very symmetric. But we could have easily found co-ethnic bias different by ethnic groups, as well as the effect of the priming different by ethnic group, but we don't find that. It's perfectly similar across the two ethnic groups. There was a question on, so this is related to, again, the lab environment. And the answer is actually, we decided not to show anything about the match except the last name and telling them which of the 6 group identity the match belonged to. Because we wanted to, again, create an environment that's devoid of everything except I know my alpha is different because I know the information about the group that is out group or in group. I can't infer whether the person has other characteristics, right? I can't infer whether they have glasses, no glasses. Everything is devoid except I have an information that this other person that I can't see, who's quote unquote simultaneously playing with me, I only know their last name through which I can infer their ethnic group. And we also explicitly tell them that they belong to one of these 6 ethnic groups, which one of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. There was one more question. Oh yes, what was that? Can you?
How the data shows significance in formation of new social identity among returnees? The topic was about the formation of new social identity. So, how the data shows significance?
So, formation of no social identities is inferred through ability of priming on migrant identity to work. So, before they went abroad, clearly they didn't have a migrant identity, right? So, and it could be latent, sitting with all the returnee migrants, or weak version of that. So what priming does is turns that on and tries to see whether it has an effect. And from that, we sort of infer that going abroad sort of creates this migrant identity. Is that it? The second question was, does the identity vary by their experience itself of returning and how it affects? We cannot answer that. All the result here is on average, right? On average, it has an effect, but you could look at, does the effect vary more if I'm more successful in terms of returning migrant and re-assimilating versus if I'm not? The power calculation of our experiment in terms of sample size does not allow us to estimate the group specific effects separately because we didn't account for that. For that, we need to have a much larger sample size to have the statistical power to do that by groups. We don't have that. What we only have is to estimate the effect by Bahun-Chhetri separately and Janajati separately, which I didn't show you, but we do it. But we don't find any different effect between the two groups.
I think we've come to the end of today's lecture. So first of all, let's say big thank you to Slesh A and big thank you to yourself as well. So I think before we close, we have a small token of love from Social Science Bahut. So I would like to hand over this to Slesh A. Thank you, Slesh A.
Thank you. Thank you guys. If anyone has questions, please feel free to start.